I took the job at the old factory because I needed the money. It wasn't a choice, really. The place had a reputation, whispered stories of accidents, strange events, and a presence that supposedly lingered there. People in town avoided talking about it, and when I mentioned the night shift to friends, they'd only glance at me with pity. I shrugged it off. Desperation beats superstition every time, or so I thought. When I walked in on my first night, the factory seemed harmless enough, if a little run-down. Long rows of silent machines stretched out under flickering fluorescent lights, and the stale metallic smell of old oil and grease hung heavy in the air. It was a tomb of forgotten machinery, abandoned in time. I got my instructions from a man named Jim, a grizzled guy with gray hair and hollow eyes that darted around the room, never quite looking directly at me. "Keep an eye on the machines," he said, voice low and gravelly. "Report any unusual activity. The cameras don't always catch everything." I asked what he meant by that, but he just shrugged, muttering something about electrical issues and faulty wiring. Then, with a final warning to stick to the main areas, he left, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. For the first hour or two, everything seemed fine. I checked the machines, occasionally glanced at the security monitors, and took note of any weird sounds. But as the hours dragged on, the place started to change. The silence became thick, pressing down on me. Every creak and groan of the metal made me jump. It felt like the factory was alive, watching me, studying me. Around midnight, the lights started flickering more frequently. I chalked it up to old wiring. The building was ancient, after all. But then, on one of the monitors, I saw movement. A shadow flickered just out of the camera's range, barely visible. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. But then it happened again. The shadow lingered, darker than the rest of the factory's gloom, moving slowly, almost deliberately, through the empty rows of machines. I told myself it was just my imagination. I'd been on edge since I got there, and the mind plays tricks in silence. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger, more oppressive, making it hard to breathe. Just after 1 a.m., I heard footsteps. They were soft at first, barely audible over the hum of the machines, but they grew louder, heavier, like someone was pacing back and forth in one of the distant aisles. Heart pounding, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped cautiously down the main aisle, sweeping the beam of light across the shadows. There was nothing, just rows of silent, unmoving machines. But as I turned to leave, I caught sight of something in the corner of my eye. A figure, standing at the end of the row, cloaked in shadow. He was tall, his face obscured in darkness. I felt an icy chill slide down my spine, freezing me in place. When I blinked, he was gone, as if he'd never been there at all. I told myself it was just a hallucination, a trick of the mind. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the job. But as the night wore on, the factory seemed to close in around me. Every sound was sharper, every shadow more menacing. The footsteps started again, louder and faster, echoing through the empty halls. They sounded closer this time, like they were just a few feet away. I ran back to the security room, locking the door behind me, trying to catch my breath. On the monitors, I saw nothing, just empty hallways and silent machines. But then, on one of the screens, a door at the far end of the factory opened slowly, creaking on its hinges. A dark figure stepped into view, its head tilted slightly as if listening, waiting. Panic surged through me, every instinct screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. My feet felt rooted to the floor, my eyes glued to the monitor. The figure moved slowly, deliberately down the hallway. He stopped every few feet, turning his head as if searching for something or someone. and then he looked directly at the camera, his face a blur of shadows, eyes glinting in the dim light. I staggered back, heart racing, as he lifted a hand and pointed directly at me. There was no mistaking it. He knew I was watching. I broke out of my trance, bolting out of the room and down the hallway. The factory was a maze, every corridor looking the same. Shadows twisted and shifted, and the footsteps returned, pounding relentlessly behind me. I didn't dare look back, terrified of what I might see. Finally, I found a side door and burst outside, gasping for air, feeling the cool night wind on my face. I looked back at the factory, expecting to see the figure standing there, watching me. But there was nothing, only the dark silhouette of the building, looming against the night sky. I didn't go back for my things. I didn't even return the next day. I sent a message to Jim saying I quit, that I'd rather be broke than spend another night in that place. A few days later, I heard that Jim had gone missing. They found his car parked outside the factory, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of him. People say he's still there, that his footsteps echo through the empty halls, and that his ghost haunts the security room, watching the monitors, waiting for the next poor soul who dares to take the night shift. I took the night shift because I needed the money. Desperation does strange things to a person, and I had bills piling up and no other options. The factory was grim, an old relic standing on the edge of town, its hulking mass silhouetted against the twilight sky. People called it haunted, a place where strange things happened, accidents, even death. But for me, it was just a paycheck. My first night on the job felt like stepping into another world. The factory floor stretched out before me, cavernous and cold, with towering machinery casting long, ominous shadows. There was a kind of silence there, a silence with a pulse, broken only by the dull hum of the machines, and an occasional skittering noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, but I pushed it aside. After all, I wasn't a kid anymore. On my rounds, I crossed paths with some of the other workers. They were mostly older guys with hard, lined faces and eyes that wouldn't meet yours for long. They'd been on the night shift for years, and something about them struck me as haunted. It didn't take long for them to start talking, in their own way, about the ghost. Old Man Henderson, one of them muttered one night, as if the name itself could summon something out of the shadows. He told me the story like he was passing on a curse. Henderson was a worker, just like us. He'd been around when the factory was new, and he'd died on the job, crushed, or maybe burned. They couldn't agree on the details, but one thing was certain. Henderson never left. His spirit was still here, bound to the factory that had been his life and his death. I laughed it off, telling myself it was just a story, something to keep the night interesting. But that changed the first time I felt it. It was late, and I was checking the gauges near the loading dock. Suddenly, a chill gripped me, sharp and unnatural, creeping down my spine and settling deep in my bones. I turned, my heart hammering, convinced I'd see someone standing behind me. But there was nothing. The place was empty, cast in an unsettling glow from the overhead lights. It felt wrong, like I was standing in someone else's space, someone who didn't want me there. After that, the little things started. Tools disappearing from my station only to show up later in strange places. Flickering lights, whispers, soft, just at the edge of hearing, threading through the factory's dark corners. They seemed to come from the walls themselves, words I couldn't understand, words I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The other guys warned me, but I shrugged it off. I couldn't be scared of some old ghost story. I had work to do, and nothing would change that. Until I heard the scream. I was alone in the break room, my feet up, trying to get comfortable on the stiff old couch. Then came a scream, shrill and raw, slicing through the factory. I leapt up, heart pounding, and ran toward the sound. As I rounded the corner, I found Frank, one of the old-timers, crouched by the assembly line. He was shaking, his face pale as a ghost himself. "I saw him," he gasped, his voice trembling. "Henderson! He was right there." I looked around, but there was nothing. Just the empty assembly line, lit by the weak, flickering lights. I tried to calm Frank down, telling him it was just stress or a trick of the light. But in that moment, a doubt took root. What if they were right? What if Henderson was real? The incidents didn't stop. They only grew worse. I started to see things, too, fleeting shadows darting just out of sight, or a strange face reflected in the glass, gone in a blink. I tried to ignore it, but the feeling of being watched gnawed at me. One night, I was making my rounds when I felt a light tap on my shoulder. I froze, every muscle in my body locked with dread. Slowly, I turned, and there he was. A shadowy figure stood inches from me. I could see the outline of his face, gaunt and expressionless, eyes hollow and fixed. It was as if he were carved out of darkness itself, his form shifting, blurred. My heart thundered, my mind a blank. I stumbled back, scrambling to keep my balance, my breath caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching me. The air around us grew colder, pressing in, until it felt like I was drowning. Then, without a sound, he vanished, dissolving back into the shadows as if he'd never been there at all. I quit the next morning. There was no way I could go back, not after what I'd seen. But even after leaving, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still with me somehow, lurking just beyond the edge of sight, waiting for his next victim to step into the factory. I still hear whispers in quiet moments, a chill that sneaks up on me when I'm alone. Sometimes when I turn off the lights at night, I think I see a shadow standing in the doorway. And I wonder, did Henderson ever leave? Or is he here with me now, a silent reminder that some places, some horrors, never let you go? It all began the day I joined Harper and Lang, a nondescript office in the heart of the city. I'd heard rumors of strange happenings on the 14th floor, but I dismissed them as idle gossip. An intern, I was determined to keep my head down, do my job, and maybe get hired full-time. The office itself was nothing remarkable, a maze of cubicles under harsh fluorescent lights, with walls as bland as the paperwork piled on my desk. I had no idea what weight it did in the shadows. Every office has its legends, its cautionary tales. At Harper and Lang, that legend was Mr. Davis. 6 months before I arrived, he'd vanished, without a trace. A senior accountant who'd practically lived at his desk, Davis was known for his obsessive attention to detail and the pipe he was never seen without. The faint scent of tobacco, lingering like a ghost of him, still haunted the air around his old cubicle. Most of my colleagues claimed they didn't know what had happened to him. He'd just vanished. At first I shrugged off the stories, laughing along when the older employees would swap rumors by the water cooler. But as weeks passed, I began to notice things. Small things, things no one else seemed to see. It started with the papers. Stacks of them would appear on my desk overnight, seemingly out of nowhere. I'd arrive each morning to find sheets arranged in odd, disorganized piles. Every time at the top of each stack, there was a single yellowed sheet with the faded initials, J.D., scrawled in the corner. I'd toss them away, convinced someone was messing with me, but the papers would always return by the next morning. And then there was the sound of footsteps. I'd hear them late in the evening, when the office was mostly empty. They would echo softly, steadily, down the rows of cubicles. They were never hurried, never rushed, always with that same measured, steady rhythm. But when I'd stop typing to listen more closely, they'd vanish, leaving only an eerie silence. But what unnerved me most was the scent, the unmistakable scent of pipe tobacco. I'd catch it wafting by me on occasion, especially near Mr. Davis's cubicle, which had remained untouched since his disappearance. The cubicle had become an informal memorial of sorts, and nobody had the nerve to clean it out. Papers lay stacked in neat, dust-covered piles. His coffee cup was still sitting on his desk, and his computer, though long unplugged, seemed to hold on to some unspoken promise of his return. One Friday evening, my curiosity got the better of me. The office was emptying out, and I decided to stay late to finally confront whatever or whoever was lurking in the shadows. I moved quietly through the maze of cubicles until I reached his desk. I felt a chill as I stepped closer, like the air itself was pushing me back. My eyes landed on the computer screen. It had been off all this time, but now it flickered to life. A message typed itself across the screen. "Help me." I stumbled backward, cold sweat prickling my skin. My phone slipped from my hand and clattered to the floor. I picked it up with trembling fingers, struggling to steady my breathing, and dialed security, my hand shaking. But the line was dead. That's when the lights in the office flickered and went out, one by one, plunging the floor into darkness. Silence fell, thick and suffocating. I was alone in the dark, alone with whatever had left that message on the screen. I heard a sound behind me, a whisper of movement. The scent of pipe tobacco grew stronger, thick and cloying, filling the air around me. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then I heard it, a low, gravelly voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Why did you take my place?" I froze. My heart thudded in my chest as I whipped around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but shadows. The darkness seemed to pulse, closing in on me, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure, tall and imposing, shrouded in shadows, its eyes glowing faintly like embers. It stood just beyond the edge of the light, watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt paralyzed, my voice locked somewhere deep inside me. The figure took a step closer, and then another. The footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, the same rhythm I'd heard night after night. The air grew colder with each step, and I could feel my heart pounding louder, threatening to burst from my chest. "Who are you?" I finally managed to whisper, though I knew the answer. This was Mr. Davis, or what remained of him, some ghostly, twisted remnant of a man who had once been flesh and blood. He reached out a hand toward me, his fingers splayed, his touch cold and clammy as it brushed my cheek. "They forgot me," he murmured, his voice carrying a note of something almost like sadness. They moved on. The lights suddenly flickered back to life, and I was alone again. Mr. Davis's cubicle was empty, as it had been for 6 months. I looked down at my hand, still feeling the icy impression of his touch lingering on my skin. I don't remember how I made it home that night. I don't remember locking the doors behind me or dropping onto my bed, too exhausted to even think. All I know is that the next morning, I arrived at work to find his cubicle empty. The stacks of paper were gone, the computer gone, his coffee cup removed. It was as if Mr. Davis had never been there. I lasted another week at Harper & Lang before I resigned, my nerves too shattered to continue. But sometimes, in the quiet of my new office, I'll catch a faint whiff of pipe tobacco. I'll hear those slow, steady footsteps echoing down the hallway, and in the quiet spaces of the night, I hear him. They forgot me. They moved on. But I'll never forget Mr. Davis. Not as long as I live.